Hi guys, we're here to talk again about some more historical accounts, and this time the subject is going to be great swords. Wonderful swords? No, great swords. So what is a great sword? We're going to be talking about the really big type of European sword that's used with two hands. And this is an area of research that I've been reading a lot of other folks who have already gone ahead and compiled sources and done their own research on. So I want to thank the people who I've been reading from who've already gone ahead and dug deep into the historical sources for this. So a special shout out to Cannon Fodder, to B.H. Abbott Motley, and to the Spadone Project, who have put a bunch of these sources I'm going to be reading from together. We'll be taking select examples from the folks who've already gone ahead and done some, in many cases, translations and adaptations so that I can read it in English and hopefully go through these sources together. So let's define what a great sword is. So previously we had seen this sword in an unboxing video. This is a Type 13A oakshot blade, and I had described it as a great sword of war. So during the 13th century, there was a bit of a spectrum of types of sword available. So we, of course, have arming swords, which are used in one hand. But as far as swords that can be used in two hands, you have these swords that Oakeshott says are, he identifies with the written accounts of great swords of war, which are bigger than what you would walk around in just your average everyday wear or wear to court. And they can be used in more than one hand, but they're still light enough and maneuverable enough that they can be used in a kind of single-handed fashion. They're bigger and more bulky than the later, let's say, 15th century period longsword, rather, from the later fencing masters' traditions. However, these are different than what are also written in the accounts of what are called two-handed swords. I'm going to start dropping the term great sword and start referring to them as two-handed swords. And here I have not a European style two-handed sword, but a sword from China's history, and actually dates back 2,000 years, closer to the period where Imperial Rome was happening over in Europe. This is a sword from China's Han Dynasty. It's called the Striking Eagle, from sword maker L.K. Chen, and it's a very long blade. So we're talking about proportions of swords where you have around a meter or more in blade length, and a very long grip, that's the proportions of which you're no longer being able to draw from the hip or use in a single hand. So whereas before we have maybe 2.5 to 3 hands in grip length, now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 more hands worth of grip length. And again, we'll see this across the board in the different languages, where in English they're called two-handed sword or what have you, the espada de dos manos, or in Spanish or Italian. In modern parlance, these would be called Zweihanders in the German, so that's perhaps the most commonly used term. But again, in Italian, we have Spadone, you have Montante. In Spanish, Beidenhander would be perhaps the more appropriate term in German. So these were in use starting as early as the 13th century, and their heyday seemed to be the 13th through the 15th century. They did continue into the 16th and 17th century, and the surviving examples, if we have a beautiful example made from a center like Passau or what have you in Germany, then in many cases those surviving examples are from later periods, from the 16th and 17th century. Did their use change compared to the earlier time period from the 13th and 15th century? As we read, we might find out. One of the important uses, or one of the most common described supposed case uses, is how they interacted in the 16th century in the area of pike and shot. And it's often supposed that they were used as a means of combating the pike formations. Could these long swords actually be used to either destroy or disrupt a pike, a long spear? Let's read the sources and find out. Okay, guys, now it's time to move on to the actual historical accounts. So a lot of this has been translated from other languages. Some of it's using crippled archaic English, so bear with me through all the attempts at reading everything and pronunciation, etc. So the first one, we're going to start with, I put it in approximate chronological order, so the first one is going to come from 1551. And it reads, so that as soon as they approached around 300 extraordinary, chosen young men who, for the praise that they had gained through great danger, called progodi della vita produti, prodigals of life and lost, emerged from both sides of the ordinanza, and with long swords they held in two hands, they began to hew those long pikes. Wherefore almost all were frightened by the courage of those, and turned their backs. Before they waited for the fury of the battalion, and here a company of paid Germans, who eagerly had assaulted the French artillery and vainly made way by the terrible fury of the Swissers, were cut to pieces. And that's from Paolo Giovio. So he's talking about a group of 300 young men who came at the pikemen with these two-handed swords. And I think that this specific account in this war is referenced in another location, and they talk about how in other retellings of this particular battle, this charge of that many people with two-handed swords is not made reference to. So this is a kind of isolated retelling of the battle and this particular incident. So this is perhaps the most famous occurrence of two-handed sword versus pike, but it's also something of an anomaly in that other witnesses or other accounts of this particular battle don't make any mention of it, and it seems a little unusual because all other kind of instances of using the two-handed swords don't show up in that number of, in that high a deployment. So perhaps this is either a mixed unit where we have two-handed swords and halberdiers both going in together, or perhaps they weren't that many, or some other confusion in the retelling of this particular account. Next up, from the same source, Vincentio Corso, too, was a captain of infamy, and Malfoto and Gabinello, who in the company of the guard of the other times, and especially in that battle, having gained praise for bravery, felling the enemies with a two-handed sword, he had opened the way for the Marquis and saluted his life. So this one guy in particular is noted for having committed great deeds with a two-handed sword. Thirdly, from the same author, and here also Zambroni and Antio Anchor, men of great spirit and terrible stature, wielding with great skill two-handed great swords, and being in the midst of the battle of the Germans, after they had hacked many pikes and cut to pieces many foes, finally facing against the entire battle, they died miserably. So kind of picking out two great heroes of old, it's talking about them specifically being really big, strong guys, and they had huge swords, and they went in there and caused a lot of mayhem, specifically in that they hacked a lot of pikes. Now, again, are they talking about the actual weapon, the pike, or the pikers, the pike holders? Hard to say for sure, but it sounds like they went in and caused a ruckus, but unfortunately were not able to get out alive. So now we're skipping forward about 15 years, so this is going to be an account from 1566. So we're already in the middle of the 16th century. And this is a note concerning halberds. They are perfect for insignia guarding too, ordered in the places they belong to, because, as was said above, they chop enemies' pikes, and with the beak, so the forking part at the top, they stick them into the ground, which thing won't be done by the big partisan. So they're specifically calling it the partisan, which is, again, kind of like a trident with a long, a much longer spear point than a traditional trident. which thing won't be done by the big partisan, nor by the two-handed sword, which weapons are worth nothing, because they have no space for swinging in that tightness of the battle, nor are they suited to stick the pikes, note, into the ground, nor with the cut can they do a lot of damage to them for the inability to wave their arms while beating due to the tightness of their fellows and the enemies, even though they have been praised by many and used with no little excess. So this is from the Disciplina Militare by Aurelio Cicuta. So, already in the span of 15 years, you have two authors. One who's basically talking about all sorts of amazing things that were executed against pikes or pikemen by two-handers. And then the next guy who says, don't use two-handed swords because they're not useful against pikemen, and instead you should be using halberds, which are much more versatile, and when you're in a tight press, you can at least stab them together or do small little chops, and the two-handed swords require much more room to move about. So, surprise, surprise, you have disagreement even within the same time period by different authors. Next up, oh, this language is going to be great. All right, so from 1548, the Wifflers on foot, proper and light persons, all apparelled in white silks or lurkins of leather cut, with white hose and shoes, every man having a javelin or slaughter sword to keep the people in array, and chains about their neck, and white feathers in their caps. So Edward Hall on the union of noble and illustrated families of Lancaster and York. So talking about the Wiffles on foot? The Wifflers on foot? Okay, next up, going down to 1570. The two-handed sword, this is an Italian account, the two-handed sword as it is used nowadays being 4 handfuls in the handle or more. So again, look at this by comparison. 1, 2, maybe 3. So they're talking about a much bigger sword than the Great Sword of War here. 4 handfuls in the handle or more, also having the great cross, was found out to the end it should be handled 1 to 1, an equal match as other weapons, of which I have entreated. But because one may with it, as a galleon among galleys, resist many swords or other weapons, therefore in the wars it is used to be placed near unto the ensign or the ancient, for the defense thereof, because being of itself able to contend with many, it may be better safeguarded the same. And it is accustomed to be carried into the city as well by night as by day, when it so chances that a few are constrained to withstand a great many. This is by Giacomo de Grassi. So, he's saying that like a galleon among galleys, like a huge ship waiting among itty-bitty ships, this sword is great when you end up finding yourself by yourself and you have to protect yourself against a whole bunch of people. You can just take the sword and say, stay back, stay back. So it says, use it for your signal, your ensign, or the ancient, which I'm not sure if that refers specifically to the commander or to the folks who are old and cannot get around, but saying use it as your back line of defense. Use it to protect your people of import, and also use it to go around the city. And this is exactly what we see start happening as we go through the 16th century and into the 17th century. So on the battlefield, it's starting to be pulled back from a frontline weapon and starting to be used to protect certain key positions. And then off of the battlefield in a civilian setting, it starts to be turned into a bodyguard role, or a role where it's serving in that of processions and honor guard and certain just very specific things. It's not something that you're just going to be carrying around each and every day. Now going on to 1581, so we're approaching the end of the 16th century. Another Italian account. It seemed to me to be my duty to approach our Italian captain, Marascali Strozzi. So we left to hear the greetings of many shots of the enemy. Around 22 hours, the bridge was laid, and the Germans were made to pass. But much earlier, many had passed through, and so the attempt to enter lasted a long time. And there were seen the efforts of some greater than paladins. But when the Germans arrived shouting at its one among the others acted as Roland, who with a two-handed Spadone hewed those pikes, which I stepped out, and by means of a body of people encamped at the square, one pushed the other forward, and good beginnings were made. For when the enemy saw themselves overtaken, they resolved to retreat into the Terra, and immediately the Germans threw themselves into the bulwark, and so took the aforementioned antemural of the Gaines. So that's from Giordano Zelletti. So this is just one account where it mentions that one guy apparently acted forward and decided to resist these oncoming Germans with who had pikes. So just taking note of a guy. So whether or not that was a common tactic, who knows? But in 1581, apparently one guy went ahead and did that with his Spadone. Now we move on to 1585. Another Italian account. Their rows are very well tight from side to side, but really large from breast to shoulders, so much that from one row to the other there is more space than a pike, and in that space, all along the shoulders from the first row, they put halberds, spadoni, 8 or 10 common steps, more or less between each other, and so in the second and third row too, if so many short weapons are found among them, to damage and shake those men on a horse or on foot who might break the first row of their big square, so they cannot pass to the second row without being disordered, and so do the other rows successively, one after the other, up to one particular moment when they cannot stop them further, so they all charge together to try a last chance in a zuffa, which is apparently a brawl. And this is what I have seen in many battles, where I found myself, and never otherwise, of Swiss and Germans. That's Giulio Cesare Branacancio. Oh, I'm terrible with these names. So he's describing how the pike squares are organized, and talking about how tight they are together, but that there's a lot of space in between each row, even more than a pike's distance between them. And they put halberds and spadone between them. So obviously the halberdiers and the two-hander guys there are there in order to, if someone manages to break their ranks, then they act as a stopgap to prevent the entire unit from losing for cohesion. Next up, going on to 1586. Well, now I pursue you, understand me, and as this nobleman did and doth honor men of his profession, so doubt you not, but likewise will others. And yet to acquit your tale, I remember I have heard him tell more than once of one poor soldier who, in rescuing or reneging another Englishman assailed by two Germans with their slaughter swords, slew them both with his own hand, even in sight, which both we and every other man must say was part of a courageous soldier, and the general often speaking thereof a sign he honor his desert and desired his advancement. So Richard Jones, writing in the English Courier in 1586, so just talking about a soldier who rescued Englishmen from 2 Germans with their giant swords. Another English account. Nevertheless, he, well liking this persuasion, went to the said camp the 2nd of June, where, after the disassembled interment and quaffing of wine, Gilliam Busk, burning with the desire of revenge of his father and uncle's death, and ministering quarrelling talk, issued out of the tent and made a fray upon O'Neill's men, and then, gathering together his Scots in the throng, suddenly entered the tent again, who there with their slaughter swords hewed in pieces Shane O'Neill, his secretary, and his company, except a very few who escaped by flight. That's from Ralph Holinshed in 1587. So, sounds like this poor guy had revenge on his mind, and they went drinking and got a bunch of his Scotsmen together, and they used their big 2-handed swords to chop everyone to pieces. So, if you ever cross someone, make sure he doesn't have a band of angry Scotsmen with 2-handed swords, I'd say. All right. Next up, when the princes of Germany are disposed to make war one against another, their militia consists of harquebusiers, pikers, and some halberdiers, and a few slaff swords for the guard of their ensigns. That's John Smythe writing certain discourses in 1589. So again, the same idea. So they're discussing that the German states do incorporate these 2-handed swords, although perhaps not in the same number. So by this point, they're definitely falling out of use and falling out of disfavor as a type of equipment. Now, from 1592, I wish no halberds in the hands of any that hath no skill. The use the same, for it is a weapon that can abide no blows, as the bill will do, but yet in the hands of officers and such as hath skill, how to use the same, it is a very good weapon. But the same must be handled delicately, with the push only, and quickly drawn back. The cause that the French officers do use them with such long staves and pikes is to encounter with lance knights, who do use being sergeants and footbands to carry very good long swords or slaughter swords. So that one's a little difficult to make out. So this guy is talking about halberds. Why would you use halberds instead of a bill? And he's recommending not using halberds. He prefers using bills. And he talks instead about French officers using halberds with long staves and pikes, but that's specifically to counter the fact that there are lance knights who also carry long swords and slaughter swords. Interesting. Next up, in 1592, the Swiss, in killing and laying on with their 2-handed swords, cried out, Montante, where those of their nation had received no quarter, and in short, all that made head against us on our side on the field were slain. So that's Blaise de Montluc from 1592. So the Swiss were doing bad things with the 2-handed swords at that point. Again, so if the account is written in 1592, this is oftentimes several years after the account of the actual battle. So just keep this in mind. We're looking backwards in time, sometimes even a couple of decades, as to when the account of the actual battle took place. Also from the same author, Signore Carnelio had with him 1 ensign of Germans, 2 of French, 4 of Italians, and 4 Senones, having also the Count de Gavas to assist him. And with me at the observance was the Rheinrock, with 3 companies of German, 2 of French, 2 of Italians, and 4 ensigns of Senones. In all, the 2 troops, both Signori Cornelio's and mine, there were not so much as 1 haqueburse, but pikes, halberds, and 2-handed swords, and those but a few. Swords and targets, and all arms proper for the close fight, and the most furious and killing weapons of all. For the stand popping and pelting with those small shot is but so much time lost. A man must close and grapple collar to collar if he mean to rid any work, which the soldier will never do so long as he has firearms in his hand, but will always fight at distance. And with no discontinuity at all, the next entry. Behind the Ritarade, a trench within the wall of the city to retire into in case of an assault, I intended to place the muskets together with the haqueburses as soon as they should be entered in, to cause the artillery and small shot to fire all at once, and we at the 2 ends then to run in upon them with pikes and halberds, 2-handed swords, short swords, and targets. This is also from Blaise de Monteluc from 1592. So he's showing that he was using 2-handed swords along with mixes of pikes and halberds and everything else. They're just mentioning them along with... I don't know if there's anything to mention the order in which those are mentioned. Pikes first, then halberds, then 2-handed swords, then finally short swords and targes. So there's perhaps a little bit of a hierarchy as far as the range or maybe the frequency of the weapons. Something to consider. Then we have from 1593, halberds, black bills, partisans, boar spears, and poleaxes, and all such like weapons to be used in hand, have one and the same use as swords and targets. But neither are the men that use them so well defended against shot and pikes, nor is that sort of weapon so effectual. If the enemy gives good ground, they are proper for execution, and may be employed in open field, in straits or woods, in assault, in sallies, and many securities. That's Matthew Sutcliffe. So he doesn't mention specifically 2-handed swords there, but he talks about how other kind of weapons in the same category as them, the halberds and the bills, where they are of use and where they aren't. Now, going on right at the end of the 16th century, in 1598, gentlemen, very formal introduction. So I perceived you would quite exclude all halberds and bills out of your battle, and not at all to be used. Captain, conclude not so short upon me, because I give them no place within the body of the battle. For if you remember in our former discourses, at the equal assortment of weapons, I allowed to every 100 men 8 or 10 halberds, which bills and halberds with other short weapons, as swords and targets and long swords and such like, shall serve as in place of best service for them to mingle with your naked troops of shot, and also placed with some pikes for the guard of the carriage and munition and ordnance, for the execution if the enemy begin to break and slay with sundry such services not contained in the body of the battle. That's Robert Barrett. So this guy is saying that he's complaining that he doesn't have access to halberds and bills, and the captain is saying that that he was allowed, out of every 100 men, 8 to 10 halberds and other weapons such as long swords included. So there was some complaint that he's not getting enough equipment, and that there, in addition to pike and shot, you have access to these things that are used to protect the carriage and ordnance. So there's this back and forth that's going on by Robert Barrett. We have another entry which looks like it's on the same topic. Gentlemen, why would you not allow short weapons in the field? Captain, truly, no, not many, yet would I exclude them all, for I know them necessary for many pieces of service, as well to perform execution if the enemy break or flee, to mingle with shot to back them if need be, to pass with convoys and to stand by your artillery, to creep along trenches and to enter into mines where the pike would be overlong. But best for the mine or breach is the target of proof, short sword, and pistol. But for the plain field, neither blackbill, halberd, or partisan is comparable to the pike. So again, that's Robert. So they're going back and forth on what equipment needs to be used in what situation. And so the gentleman who's writing to the captain is like, hey, would you, if we're equipping your troops, are you not going to include short weapons at all? And he's like, no, there's a place for short weapons, because you can't take a pike into a mine or into a trench, or to go sneaking along. But out in an open field, then if you have a blackbill or a halberd or a partisan, there's no way it's going to stand up to a pike. So at the turn of the year 1600, that is what Robert Barrett had to say on the matter. Not exactly a two-handed sword, but it's kind of in the same vein, and probably why we start seeing the retirement of these long two-handed weapons on the battlefield, because the combination of pikes and firearms starts to reduce the use of those sorts of weapons on the battlefield. The engagement distances are changing. So now crossing into the 17th century, the beginning of the 17th century, here's an Italian, I believe it's an Italian account, it might be Spanish, from 1613. They could have held them and beaten them too, one can believe, and more easily if they had a bunch of Spadoni in the first line, with whom they would have cut the tips of the enemy's pikes without being able to have been hit by them. That's Girolamo Francetta from 1613. So this writer believed that he's talking about a hypothetical situation where they were in a situation, and again, this may not be talking about a current scenario. This may have been reflecting on a battle in the past, maybe even a couple decades previous, where the troops were encountering a situation where the pikes were going after them, and they did not have access to Spadoni, so great swords, and the writer feels that if they had them, maybe that would have made the difference. Hypothetical situation, but it's still interesting to hear from the mind of a writer in the period. Yeah, so specifically he's writing about the Battle of Soriano, which was all the way back in 1497. So that's more than 100 years prior. So he's reflecting on a much older battle. Next, from 1615. The Susies, this might be Swissers, I'm not sure. The Susies, which be professed soldiers, are commonly well furnished with arms in their houses, and sometimes the towns do furnish them out of their storehouses with arms, the which are the haqueburs, the pike, the halberd, and the two-handed sword. They are much given to war, and observe good order, and they love the corselet and pike, with a longsword and a dagger, and they also serve with harqueburs. They are of mean stature but strong, and that's Pierre de Avity. All right, talking about the Sucies. I assume that they meant the Swiss in this case. Speaking specifically about the Swiss in 1617, the Switzers' kind of army are musket, calciers, ashen pikes 18 feet long, halberds, long two-handed swords, which they carry on their shoulders, and with them they defeat the Burgundians coming to handstrokes with them. And another long sword girt to their side, with a dagger very heavy, the hafts of silver or gilded, and arms of solid steel for their breast and back. Now, this is kind of interesting. So this is written in 1617. The two-handed swords were outlawed by some cantons in Switzerland as early as in the 1490s. So depending on what areas they're talking about, it would be interesting if they're talking about in the 17th century the use of two-handed swords by Swiss units, Swiss troops. Yet at the same time, if they're talking about long swords being worn at the hip, a long sword girt to their side, Swiss are famous perhaps for the use of the Schneip, the so-called Swiss saber, which is effectively a single-edged longsword, complex-hilted longsword, which became popular in the middle of the 16th century and was certainly still in use in the 17th century. So it's possible that they're also referring to that as a second sword in addition to the long two-handed sword which they carry on their shoulder. So that's a bit of an interesting two-part sword. So carrying both a long sword and a two-handed sword in this case. From 1642. Another Swiss description. Lastly, weapons should be so made that they be made with conveniency, and as much as can be with advantage to used in all places and at all times. For their chiefest virtue is in their generality of use. Hereupon the short, strong sword is held better than the long rapier, or the Schweitzer useth the two-handed swords. So that's Donald Lupton from 1642. So he's suggesting trying to use the best weapon at their time and recommending that the quote-unquote short, strong sword is the superior weapon. Don't go using all these fancy swords. Don't use the rapier, or don't use, as specifically the Swiss use, the two-handed sword. So, again, going against what I just mentioned before, that the Swiss had perhaps outlawed the use of the two-handed sword, this guy is specifically talking about the two-handed sword being a Swiss weapon of war. Very interesting. All right, next up, all the way from 1671, so we're getting towards the mid to late 17th century. The former difficulties with this edict easily wrought upon Pizarro's men, all but 12 to leave him, for the rest went over with the ship fitted out by Rios with succor to the island Gallo, where Pizarro resided, having also failed in his second expedition. But, although he made 2 bad voyages, yet having an inclination to a third attempt, he went to Spain, desiring of the emperor to be governor of Peru, which he had discovered, for beside his pleas of merits, he had taken possession of the country twice by landing there, intended for the use of his imperial majesty one of his seamen, to the purpose of flourishing his two-handed sword over his head, the glistening of which sword so frightened the natives that none of them durst come near him. That's John Ogleby on America. So obviously a recounting of the adventures in the New World in the 15th century. So this is writing about a much earlier time, more than 100 years prior. In 1678, we have the Spadone is a type of sword whose two-edged blade is very long and broad, and whereof the haft, which I dare not call a handle because it is 1.5 feet long,
is made crossways. It cannot be used but with both hands, in a breach or behind a palisade. I never saw so many espadones as among the Hollanders. The ramparts of all their towns were furnished with them, each distant from the other 6 paces, with a like number of clubs or maces. And indeed, to consider such preparatives, one would have thought their designs had been furious, and they had a great mind to defend themselves stoutly. But there is great appearance that they only place these arms there to adorn their parapets. That's Luz de Gaia. So Lewis in 1678 has apparently visited the Hollanders and notices that they have tons and tons of these two-handed great swords around, but he feels that by the end of the 17th century that they are just there as decorative objects, not as items of war. And so he, as an Iberian, is finding them out of the ordinary, to at least see this many of them. Also, from the same author in the same time, the German horse have for arms the Schabel, carbine, and wheellock pistol, with a Schabel hanging from the pommel of their saddles. Some of their troops are armed with cuirass and headpieces. The foot carry the sword, musket, espadon, or two-handed sword, and the pike. The officers make use of swords, pikes, and gorgets, and some partisans or half-pikes. So that suggests that, at least at some point, the Germans were still using these large two-handed swords. It would be interesting to see if he's talking about a current, presumably he's talking about the current equipment of Germans even as late as 1678. It's always interesting to see these accounts of them not referring to their own troops, but looking at the other nation and saying, "Oh wow, those guys are still using the big two-handed sword. How interesting is that?" Whereas you rarely find someone describing their own equipment and talking about its use. So this was a little quick trip talking about different encounters and how the sword slowly seems to have been relegated into obsolescence. It on the battlefield, as engagement distances changed and as the press of men became less and less, as more and more guns became used, as more and more pike warfare became used, it seems as if the big two-handed sword, which was popular from the 13th and 15th century, became a thing, a relic of bygone age. They were still made, but their use became much more limited, and the ones that were produced were used for different purposes. They seemed to be more of a status thing. Could they still be used? Sometimes, perhaps, but they seemed to be functionally very different than the same size weapon that was produced in the centuries prior. Anyway, I hope that everyone found that as interesting as I did. We'll see everyone next time. Take care.